right there to see better. Well, first of all, a big thank you to CEU for hosting this event. It's very generous, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity. I mean, it's an important location, I think, and we're very proud to be able to do this here. And let me just say a few words about the status report in general. This is obviously not a one-man show. This is a team of interdisciplinary experts, 8 main authors that work on this from 6 countries, including 4 university professors that have contributed to this, and including the co-founder and chairman emeritus of the Rocky Mountain Institute in the United States, Amory Lovins, who's one of the best known energy thinkers that are around. So we have a quite extraordinary team that has put together this rather thick report with 323 pages. So I encourage everybody anyway to have a look at it, because it's actually quite visual, as you're going to see from the slides I've extracted. Now, the first thing when we're talking about energy policy is that on energy, you will not understand anything if you look at a picture, meaning like if you look at statistics of one given year. It's like looking at a photograph rather than looking at the movie. The energy industry is a very slow industry. It's a long-term investments, and it takes many years between you know, the initial thoughts for facilities and they're actually delivering electricity in this case. So here is the projections that existed in the middle of the 1970s by various players for installed nuclear capacity for the year 2000. And I'm just picking out 2. One is by the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the other one is by the OECD. The IEA's scenario was labeled the most likely in 1974, the most likely. This is not the high scenario. The high scenario is somewhere up there in the sky. The most likely scenario had forecasted 3,600 installed gigawatt. What does that mean? It's 1 gigawatt is 1,000 megawatts. That's roughly the size of a nuclear power plant. So, in other words, they forecasted something like 3,500 nuclear reactors by the year 2000. The reality we have down here. So reality, which was around 350 gigawatts or 350 reactors roughly, is less than a tenth of what was originally thought of. This had huge consequences for planning, for investment, etc. So what we are actually looking at in particular is reality, right? So this is an empirical analysis to what actually happened in the past in order to get a better understanding of what the future will look like. So this is a multi-indicator assessment. So never look just at one indicator. It's not very meaningful. You have to put them all together in order to get a real picture of what the situation is. So that's the first one. It's reactor startups and closures in the world. The upper part is showing reactor connections to the grid, and the lower part is reactor disconnections. Like for us, a startup is grid connection, closure is grid disconnection. And as you see that we had these 2 waves, the first one in the 70s, second one in the 1980s, and then this flat development until today, with the exception of the upper part here, which is China's nuclear program, which entirely dominated the past 15 years. And we see on the other side the delayed impact of Chernobyl the Chernobyl accident in 1986, and the break of the wall. Actually, it's like a combined effect that led to these reactor closures. And then we see the Fukushima effect that happened in March 2011 with a huge impact on reactor closures. If we look at the same graph for the European Union, it shows that it was basically over in terms of startups a long time ago. And those were the three last reactors that were connected to the grid. So the closures have dominated the picture for a long time. We look at the cumulated effect. So we see like this uninterrupted rise of the number of reactors operating. The red line is the installed capacity. Until the late 80s, it continued to rise, and then we have this plateau until the events of Fukushima with its sharp drop, and then an increase over the past 5 years, 6 years even, to 417 reactors now. So this is a typical example. If you just look at the last few years, one could say, oh, well, this is an increasing industry. Like, I mean, it's going up the hill. Well, it's very true, except that the numbers are very small. Like the increase, the relative increase is very small. And the absolute figure of 417 reactors is still below the number we had reached already 30 years ago in 1989. And the absolute historic peak was in 2002 with a lot more reactors, 438 installed. The operating capacity has the curve has a little different shape, right, than the number of reactors. So it continued to increase, although the number of reactors was plateaued. The main reason is that if reactors were closed, they were smaller than the ones that started up. And the second reason is it happened through so-called uprating. So existing reactors were upgraded, the capacity was increased through technical means. So we have this effect where it's not entirely parallel. We have actually achieved a new maximum of installed capacity in 2018, or currently at mid-2019, just slightly over the previous record of 2006. Same picture again for the European Union, and we see that the overall long-term trend has been going downwards for the past 30 years, with a maximum of reactors operating achieved in 1989, and we see that it's almost 50 units less in operation as we speak. Next indicator, we look at electricity generation. And we have had a historic maximum in 2006. And we have had an increase over the past few years. We've seen the installed capacity went up, numbers of reactors went up. In total, but we also see that which role China plays in this. And although there was a 2.4% increase globally, much of that increase was due to China, and much to that increase was actually due to China over the past years, because as you see, the red stacks didn't really move, right? I mean, what moved is the Chinese program. The other indicator is the relative share of nuclear power in the overall electricity mix, which peaked in 1996 with about 17.5%, and it has been slowly declining to currently just over 10%. I must say that it is always important that you keep in mind that these figures are always on the commercial energy industry. It means, like, for example, we have a cabin in Canada that is off-grid, where we generate solar power and store it for the past 30 years. None of those kilowatt hours of that production are in these figures. because they're off-grid. They're not going through any kind of accountability. Now, of the past couple of decades, the number of facilities that are off-grid, so they're not accounted for in the official statistics, has been boosted all over the planet. So these figures are always partial when it comes to the actual share of non-commercial electricity generation. Next, who is generating nuclear power? There's 31 countries currently, which is about a 15% share of the countries represented at the UN. So it's a small share of countries of the planet. We also see that it's very much concentrated about a number of big players, and as it has been the case over the past few years, roughly 5 countries roughly generate 70% of the nuclear power in the world. That is by order: the United States, France, China, Russia, and South Korea. China has been moving up the ladder continuously now to the 3rd position, and we also see that, you know, the United States, in terms of total output, very largely dominates the picture, and the 2 first players together generate 47% of the world's nuclear electricity. So almost half is generated by only 2 countries. It's just to say that it's a very concentrated effect. It's not like a spread out phenomenon throughout the world. The other column on the right-hand side shows the relative share of nuclear in the commercial electricity, and you see that the dates that are in the back show the historic peak. And as you can see, that, you know, some of the shares have been going down significantly, and the actual achievement of the historic peaks has been many years ago. If we try to get an idea of where is this going, the number of reactors that are listed as under construction is obviously a key indicator. And as you can see here, it peaked in the middle of the the late 1970s. So in 1979, it peaked at 234 units. Another good example of why it's so important to look at the long-term developments, because if you represented this graph from 2005 onwards, you would get a very different picture, and it wouldn't really reflect the fact that the 46 reactors that are under construction listed currently is a small share of what has been under construction in the late 1970s. And while there has been a significant increase between 2005 and 2013, we have now 22 reactors less under construction, as was the case 5 years ago. So even there we have another trend that has been reversed over the past few years, and obviously Fukushima is here one of the key events that drove this development. Now the other thing that is remarkable is that you see these parts in this brownish red or reddish brown, which is reflecting the share of projects that actually have not been completed. So if there are 46 reactors today in the list as under construction, it does not mean automatically that they will generate power one day. A lot of these reactors have not been completed. So of the 48 out of these 234 have not been completed. And it's been a phenomenon throughout nuclear history. We have counted 94 reactors that have been abandoned at various stages of construction. And this is like on a timeline by country, and you see like the United States have been dominating the statistics in the 1980s with the largest number of abandoned projects. Russia was an important player in the 1990s, and there's a number of countries that have had intermediate numbers of units abandoned in the 1980s. And the phenomenon has been less remarkable, but it still exists. The latest ones to be abandoned was in 2017, the 2 reactors in the United States, 2 reactors in South Carolina, and the name of the site is VC Summer. And I mean, the idea, you have to keep in mind, this is actually spending a lot of money without any outcome, right? So the current estimate is more than $10 billion had been spent on this construction site, with the outcome 0. Like there were, I believe, 9 increases in tariffs for the consumers, the local consumers, with an outcome that is strictly 0. So they're paying basically for an abandoned construction site. I don't think that is the most effective way to spend ratepayers' money. Who is building? No surprise here. China is still leading with 10 units. India with 7, Russia with 5. A total of 46, we've said that. The other 2 points I want to make, one is that some of these reactors have been under construction for over a decade. Actually, 2 have been under construction for over 3 decades, which is, you know, pretty long to wait for a facility to generate income. And we see that the phenomenon of delayed constructions is something very present. So we can document at least 27, between 27 and 29 of 46 that are behind schedule, many of them for several years. Here we have tried to illustrate the evolution of construction times. So to get an idea of you know, how many reactors were connected to the grid, so that's the size of the balls, of the bubbles, and how the construction time developed over time. And we can see there was a very clearly identifiable trend until the late 1980s. The balls became bigger, so more reactors connected to the grid, and an increase in construction time. And after the 1990s, it's like complete anarchy. Like no rules to the game anymore. The balls jump all over construction time, so it's very difficult to actually make sense out of this picture, except that the balls, obviously, as we've seen before, are very small. So there's a small number only that of units that have come online. We assess this project by project, country by country, and you see that if we look at the past decade, 63 reactors were connected to the grid. A staggering 37 of these were connected to the grid in China, which is quite an industrial achievement. We see Russia has connected 8. We see that the average construction time is around 10 years, with a huge range from about 4 years to over 40 years. That's a record holder in the United States. What's Bar 2 is probably going to stay the record holder for some time. But we see, like for all of the countries, pretty large ranges. We have looked at the construction times, expected versus real construction times of the reactors that have been connected to the grid between the beginning of 2018 and the middle of 2019. And we see that roughly the pattern here is that construction times have doubled. So the construction times that were staying roughly within the expected time frame were all 3 in China. All the others, even if we leave alone this record holder here from Russia with 35 years since construction start, roughly the average is that the construction times have doubled compared to original expectation. Next indicator, obviously important, is construction starts. Always the same pattern. We have these developments in the 1970s and 80s, with a peak in 1976 of 44 construction starts. Just for those interested in the more technical side, a construction start is not cutting the trees or building a road. Construction start runs only from the moment on when the base mat, the foundation of the reactor building is poured. That's important because in reality the overall project time is much longer than the actual construction time. Just keep that in mind. And construction start means pouring the concrete. So we have this development where we had actually seen even in 1995 a year without any construction start. And a very flat blue part, so that's the world without, outside China, and China totally dominating construction starts with up to 10 or 15 in 2010. But it's remarkable the absence of China over the past few years, and it's not quite clear how this is will be playing out over the next few years, because the last time that a commercial reactor construction was begun was in December 2016, which is already quite some time ago. So we have seen on a global level 5 construction starts in 2018 and 1 so far in 2019. Always keep that in mind, compare that with what happened in the 1970s. So it basically, I just calculated, it basically took 7 years to do one reactor less construction start than in 1 year in 1976. No surprise here, if there's no construction, the average age increases every year. And this is the first year that the average age of the operational fleet is exceeding 30 years. I mean, 30 years on average, including 80 units that have operated for 41 years and more, and 192 for 31 years and more, between the two up to 40 years. So this represents basically another technological age, right? I mean, 40 years ago is, I don't know who remembers what the cars looked like 40 years ago. But they looked quite differently from what they look today, I can assure you, because I do remember. And a nuclear power plant that has been here for operating for 40 years means been started to build for 50 years ago. So it was designed over 50 years ago. So we're literally talking about, another planet that, has generated these facilities to begin with. This is the age of the EU fleet. We see a similar pattern, except it's even older. So it's over 34 years now on average, with a very large share of units that have generated been connected to the grid for 31 and more years. Now, we always have in the report what we call focus countries. So we select a number of countries that we assess in depth. This in-depth assessment is individual and can look very differently from one country to the other. So the authors have a great freedom to process these countries. So they are not, the analysis is not necessarily comparable. So I give you a few blips, because every country has a major analysis. So this is on France. What we did here is we wanted to understand what the actual unavailabilities of reactors it's been a constant argument to say, well, nuclear provides power 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In France, there's 58 operating nuclear power plants. These 58 reactors totaled over 5,000 reactor days without any production, so 0 kilowatt hours. Over 5,000 reactor days. Or, in other words, an average zero production of 87.6 days, which is, to make it simple, almost 3 months. So 3 months, no production per reactor per year. I would say this is quite far from 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We also looked at, what was the actual overlap of these outages, and just to look at the peak here. So at the most there were 27 reactors of 58 that were at zero power at the same time. And it's important to stress that of course a lot of times production is reduced. So this does not take into account reduced production. It only takes into account the days or the time that is where production was at zero. We did the same for Belgium, and in 2 words, the outcome is actually even more amazing, with a total average outage time of 180 days per reactor. So that is, if my calculation is correct, is almost 6 months. So almost half of the year, on average, the reactors were at zero production in Belgium in 2018. Another blip on Germany, because there's all kinds of myths floating around on Germany, that decided in just after, 4 months after the events of the 11th March of 2011 in Fukushima, to phase out nuclear power. So we compare the system between 2010, the year pre-Fukushima, and 2018. So nuclear, with the progressive nuclear phase out, production decreased by 64.5 billion kilowatt hours, that is terawatt hours, while the renewable energy output increased by 121. In other words, it was almost twice compensated by renewables. But what is important here is that at the same time, consumption decreased by 20 terawatt hours, which in my taste is very far from being enough, but that's another issue. The export, the net export of electricity increased by 33 terawatt hours, and the fossil fuel generated electricity decreased by 43.5 terawatt hours. So these are very significant indicators also in the climate change debate, of course. So that the nuclear phase out is not necessarily combined with an increase in greenhouse gas emissions and the use of fossil fuels. Please.
Do you have a rough number for what the total consumption of Germany is in a year? So what that relates to in terms
of total? I don't have the number offhand, but the order of magnitude is 500 terawatt hours, I would say. But that's not quotable, so that's the order of magnitude. The status report also has, like sort of traditionally every year, a chapter that looks at a comparative assessment in the nuclear sector versus developments in the renewable energy sector, and specifically focusing after, as you will see, on solar and wind, like new non-big hydro renewables. So what we see here is the global investment decisions on new renewables and versus nuclear power. There is no publicly available database for investments in nuclear power. So what we did is sort of a back of an envelope calculation. we assume that when the decision is made to start construction of a nuclear power plant, there is sort of a rough estimate of what it would cost in the public domain. And we decided to take that as the investment decision. That's why we call it investment decision and not investment. We decided to take that as an order of magnitude of investment, and we apply it to the entire sum to the given year of construction start. So obviously it doesn't really reflect reality, because the money is stretched out, the spending is stretched out over the years. So in reality it's actually less. But the basic reading here is that this is very much dominated by China, of course, because they have started most of the construction sites over the past 15 years. And the basic analysis is that it's at least a factor of 10, so an order of magnitude below of what is spent on nuclear compared to renewable energies. The reason is very simple. We have had a dramatic decline in costs for renewable energy technologies. This is an assessment by Lazar Bank. I like estimates like that as assessments because it's not partisan, right? I mean, they're not builders, they're not industry, they're not involved the same way as other stakeholders here. So their assessment of what is called the levelized cost of energy value. So you look at various projects and you make a sort of an average of those projects. Solar came down over the past decade, since 2009 to 2018, by 88%. So we're getting close to a factor of 10 of reduction in cost. This is very significant. Wind power costs declined by about 69%. Gas, by the way, came down too, by roughly 30%. Minor development, less than 10% in the coal sector, and the only sector where costs went up is the nuclear sector. So we're talking here generating costs of new facilities. So what happened over the past decade in terms of power generation in the world? And looking, if we index it in 2008, we look at what was actually added by, net added by every year by technology. And we realize that already non-hydro renewables have added most of the additional electricity generation. And hydro has, like, almost twice as much as hydro has added actually over the time frame, while the generation in nuclear is actually below the level of what was generated in 2008. So those are the orders of magnitude, and I invite you always to look at the shape of the graphs more than the figures, because the shapes actually tell you the story more than the figures. And here we have a few nice shapes of graphs. This is the capacity added in wind, solar, and nuclear since 2000. You see this dramatic increase in wind and solar, and the stagnation on the nuclear side. The same on the production, where if you compare if you put the baseline on 1997, which was the signature of the Kyoto Protocol, that's why we did that. We wanted to see, since the signature of the Kyoto Protocol, what have the various technologies actually added in terms of electricity. And we see the leader here is really wind by far, and solar has passed nuclear in added electricity. Here are the cumulative numbers. So this is not added anymore, not indexed. These are actually the absolute numbers. So we see that in installed capacity, solar has now gone beyond the installed capacity of nuclear. Of course, the same capacity doesn't generate necessarily the same amount of electricity, so nuclear is still generating more power than wind and solar combined, but it's getting, the trend is very clear. So one has to look at trends besides the absolute numbers. Now, just a few examples for the developments in certain countries. Here's wind. So here's China and the evolution 2000 to 2018. It's really staggering to what extent China has actually built up its renewable energy industry, and you see now that in spite of the fact that China is the only country, and it's the country that has been massively investing into nuclear power, wind turbines alone generate more power in China than nuclear power. And solar is catching up quickly. What happened in the EU? This is very interesting because basically, there is hardly any investment anymore. This is startup and closure of generating capacity in the past year. So we have wind, we have solar, we have other renewables like biomass, for example, is the biggest chunk in there. And then we have a tiny little bit more of natural gas, no change in nuclear, and a decline in fossil fuels. This is the past year's reality. These are not projects. This is what has been connected to the grid. And the order of magnitude is 95% of what was connected was renewable. So it's actually happening, right? We are not talking some kind of wild vision or so, or some kind of fantasy. It's industrial reality. We look at the capacity numbers. In terms of installed, these are absolute numbers. So solar is almost caught up to nuclear in installed capacity terms in the EU. Actual production remains still below, but again, the trend is very clear. Nuclear production goes down, the other two go up. We have here the capacities added. This is more dramatically, actually, if you look at it from a perspective of the change that took place since 2000, with the increase in solar, decrease in nuclear, and the same on the production side. A country that is often forgotten, although it apparently has now the highest number of inhabitants on this planet, is India. And in India, there's sort of a short-term, absolutely incredible revolution that took place in the solar sector. I mean, look at this jump that took place in the installed capacity over the past couple of years. And of course, we've seen wind overtaking nuclear already a few years ago. A stagnation in the nuclear production, and I wouldn't be surprised if this is the year where solar overtakes nuclear power in India in output, in production, in actual electricity generation. So this was a lot of focus on these comparative analysis of performance of various electricity generating technologies. So what does that mean for the whole climate change issue? We need to keep in mind that the generation of electricity is only about 20% of the final energy, but has a very much larger share, like 38% in 2016, of the overall CO2 emissions. So the power sector is important. It's not because it's only 20%. The share is increasing constantly, but it's also it's the largest chunk of CO2 emissions. So it's important. Now, what is the challenge here? And I'm very much insisting on the definition of the challenge, because everything is in the question. We are increasingly under time pressure. Diana Ilgeforsatz has presented this from an IPCC perspective. Its time is getting short. So when some colleagues in the energy sector come up with some wild ideas for the second half of the century of technologies, or I don't know what, fusion is my favorite there, I have a very simple answer. I'm not interested, because it's going to come too late anyway. So what I'm interested in is, you know, if you invest money, and it doesn't matter whether it's $1 or euro or foreign, how much reduction in greenhouse gas emissions can you buy for it? How fast? And it's the combination between cost and time that makes the measure of effectiveness. This is crucial to understand. One doesn't work without the other. Like if we have low carbon technology that are available maybe in the second half of the century, there's no point in talking about this now. We need to discuss first what we can do now, today, basically, and in the short term. And we cannot spend money twice. I mean, it's only there once. So the 10 billion plus that have been spent in the United States for pouring concrete and melting steel on a project that will never see the light is a huge blow to climate change, because that money has not been put into strategies that come up with short-term clear effects on the emission reductions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. So I have given you the picture on nuclear power. Over the past decade, new nuclear power took about 10 years, and again, construction start to grid connection, about 10 years. That's much longer than many other options that are on the table. And this is combined, like the slowness is combined with very high costs. So it makes it basically the worst option. It's not even an option if you think about it, because we have neither the time nor the money to spend on that option. So what remains is the question of existing nuclear power plants, but because they're there. So you can argue this is very fast. You just have to keep them running, and they will generate power that is low carbon. Well, it's very simple. The argument doesn't change. The question is, how much does it cost? Even if you leave entirely on the side specific problems that nuclear power plants can have, and some people are concerned about: safety, nuclear proliferation, nuclear waste issue, etc. We don't talk about this here. We're just, if you just take the climate issue, the actual reasoning remains the same. And we have looked at that in some detail. Now, this might look as like a wild graph, but I'll try to explain. It's actually less wild than it seems. First, this is concentrating mainly on the US. There are some international blips in there, but it's basically based on US figures. What we have here in this range part of the graph, we have the evolution of the range of the wholesale power price in the United States market. So we have had, a pretty regular decline of the overall wholesale market price. Then we have here the US average nuclear operating costs. There's not that much movement. We have seen an increase until around 2012, and then a slight decrease of the past 5 years on average. Now, on the whole utility scale solar average power purchasing agreement cost level in the United States, you see this staggering decrease. This is a much bigger decrease than we've seen in the Lazar figures that I've shown earlier. And these are power purchasing agreements. We're talking, you know, this is commercial. You know, this is not a study. This is actually commercially traded electricity. And we see this huge decline, which if you look at the end of that level here, it's getting close to $20 per megawatt hour. That's the lower level of the wholesale price range. $20. We're not talking about minima. This is important. These are power utility sale PPAs on average, so it's various projects. So the absolute lowest numbers are below $20 per megawatt hour now. That's staggering. And now we're looking at wind, which has gone even below the level of solar in power purchasing agreements. And now come in these kind of strange things here. These are quartiles. So the nuclear power industry has been, like in many countries, refusing to publicly transmit information on the actual costs of individual reactors. That's what we actually need in order to make policy and industrial decisions. They're not publicly available. So what they do is they look at the quarter of the plants that are the most expensive ones to run, and then the quarter, they put it into quarters, and they average it out over 3 years, right? So the first is 2012 to 2014, the second one is 2014 to 2016. So it's really averaged out. It's just to say, this is flattened out, right? So the extremes are much larger than that. But it already shows that, you know, from that perspective, you know, even the most cost-effective quartile is not competitive anymore with new solar and new wind in the US market. So these are real numbers. These are not studies. I really insist on that, because one has to be always very careful what is hypothesis and what is actually figures on the ground. So this is one of the biggest problems of the nuclear industry here. And what we see here also is, like on one hand, these rectangular indicators below here is, these are December 2017 figures from Colorado, and they're median bids. So they're not, again, it's not extremes, they're median bids. And 2017 is, December 2017 is almost 2 years ago. And you can publish new figures basically every month, because the decline has been continuing all the time. But you see that these non-subsidized costs, they include storage. So solar with storage becomes competitive with the average cost of nuclear power in the grid. So new solar plus including storage is the same cost or cheaper than operation and maintenance costs for nuclear power, leaving investment aside. That's the basic message. And we're talking unsubsidized. And obviously, the lowest numbers you can find, you can go cherry picking around the world, and you find incredible numbers now as the lowest numbers for solar and wind electricity generation. I'm going to jump this to save some time. So I'll conclude with this. We have seen that there's a very low level of nuclear construction, so it's no surprise that for the first time we have now a world nuclear fleet that is has over 30 years of operational time. In 2018, if we do the analysis, the annual analysis, nuclear power added 9 gigawatts and renewables added 165. And that gives you this kind of relationship that we have in the field. Nuclear power generation increased by 2.6%. I think the number is actually 2.4. That should be an error. Most of that increase was through China. Wind increased by 29% and solar by 13%. We have seen the numbers on construction sites very low, far too low to actually maintain that industry in good shape. Average construction times have increased in many cases and average now 10 years over the past decade. While nuclear costs increase, solar and wind continue to decrease all over the world. So the conclusion on climate change is quite clear. If we want to fight climate change, which increasingly has been termed the climate emergency, we need to invest into effective strategies that combine speed and competitive costs in order to achieve results of drastic emissions reductions. And I think it's clear now that nuclear power has turned out as not only the most expensive, but above all, the slowest option to generate so-called low carbon. And I didn't want to get into that debate about low carbon or no carbon or this carbon. It's irrelevant to this basic point. Electricity and to actually provide fundamental energy services to the citizens of this planet. Thank you very much for your attention.